Funding for this program is provided by Bruce Foods Corporation, makers of the complete line of Cajun King seafood seasoning mixes and other distinctive Louisiana-style food products. And by the Dairy Farmers of Louisiana. When you want good programming, just add milk.
Louisiana. Hi, I'm Chef John Folse, welcoming you to the bayous of South Louisiana. Today, Cajun and Creole cooking holds a prime spot in the world of international cuisine, and I would love for you to know a little bit about it. So why not sit back, relax, and join me and some of my friends as we cook up another great Taste of Louisiana. Are y'all all in your breakfast frame of mind today? Hello everybody, I'm Chef John Folse and welcome to A Taste of Louisiana. Today we're going to look at the foods associated with the Louisiana Planters Breakfast. That's right, all of the early planters who came and settled the river road of Louisiana and all of the great foods that they created after working on those farms all day long. When we talk about planters in Louisiana, what are we talking about? Well, let's see, there were cotton farmers, there were indigo farmers, the ones who raised the great dye plant. Of course, there was rice and sugarcane, the king of all of the crops in Louisiana. Fact is, here we're looking at the harvesting of sugarcane. Sugarcane is harvested in the fall in Louisiana, normally beginning sometimes around October and finishing right before Christmas. Fact is, I grew up on one of these big old sugar plantations in the bayous of South Louisiana. Here we have a cane cutter just going down the rows, and you can see that a big blade is cutting the stalks of cane and laying them right over to the right of the rows where the loaders will come and pick up these stalks and bring them to the factory. Here we burn the husk right off of the cane. We remove all of the trash before loading them onto the trucks to bring them to the mill for processing. Sugarcane, one of the great industries of Louisiana. And once the cane arrives at the sugar mill, this is, I think, Cora, Texas, one of the great sugar mills, or maybe Sinclair Sugar House. These sugar mills just dot the whole landscape of South Louisiana. They're washed a little bit so that the soot is off of the stalks and then put into the mill for grinding. Absolutely one of the greatest industries of South Louisiana, the sugarcane industry. And boy, do I remember being in those fields many a cold day in the wintertime in Louisiana. Well, let's talk about the planter's breakfast. You know, when I think of planters, I think of names like Scheck-Snyder, Wagesback, Steins, Weber, Stives. That's right, all German names. And why German? I know you're thinking this is supposed to be Cajun and Creole country. That's French and Spanish and all those other nations, right? Well, the first planters to come to Louisiana came in about 1690. About 10,000 of them came from the Alsace-Lorraine region. And they came to Louisiana lured by the French to, let's face it, grow a lot of foods for this brand new colony. And when they arrived in Louisiana, they were promised a lot of land wealth. They were promised the tools to create the farms, as well as some of the labor that would be needed. And sure enough, they left the city of New Orleans, traveled about 45 miles upriver on each side of the Mississippi, east and west bank, to St. Charles Parish, St. John the Baptist Parish, and St. James Parish to create these great plantations. They actually carved out the landscape of the bayous because 150 years later, the great sugar plantations would come out of the ground in those same areas. Well, the foods obviously had to be a very hearty type of cuisine because these planters had to get into the swamps, dig out trees, stumps, pull them out, build rows, plant seeds. Imagine the amount of work that was going on. A hearty breakfast indeed. Of course, with the 100-degree temperatures in the bayous of Louisiana, you can imagine that they had to get into the fields mighty early. And they did. They got into the fields about 5 o'clock in the morning, and by 10 o'clock they were quite hungry. So the planter's breakfast, obviously, was the main meal of the day. And I know what you're thinking, why don't you just shut up and start cooking? Well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shut up and start cooking, but I have to tell you that it was, in fact, the main meal. They would come in at 10, sit around elaborate tables of all this gracious food and eat a big, big meal, and then rest under the oak trees and out of that hot sun and 99% humidity until about 4 or 5 o'clock, when they would go back into the fields again to make the rows ready for the planting. What's some of the dishes typical of the planter's breakfast? Well, I'm glad you asked. The first thing is going to be pork chops, because obviously there was a tremendous amount of pork in Louisiana. And the pork chops, as you can see, are cut very, very thin, because it was almost like a bacon, and they would be pan-fried. And I'm going to fire up my skillet here a little bit. The pork chops, if they were a little bit too thick, would be pounded slightly with a little bitty meat mallet like this. The mallet had little tines on one end and could be really pounded hard into the meat to spread it out, because the planters liked the pork chops very, very thin. For seasoning, of course, just a little bit salt, a little bit pepper, very, very simplistic spices patted right down into the pork chops, and then dusted lightly in flour. Again, never too thick, just slightly, slightly dusted to coat the outside of the pork chop. One of the great dishes that probably emerged from this dish right here is the famous grillades of South Louisiana that we eat on the grand brunches today. The New Orleans jazz brunches will always have grillades, and it's just a smothered pork dish, obviously from the planter's breakfast 100 years before. We put the pork chops into the little black iron skillet, just like that, and we allow the pork chops to saute on one side until golden brown. And once they get nice and brown on one side, naturally we'll take them and flip them over so that we can get the other side nice and brown the same way. We do want a really nice brown look to them. And of course, the seasonings for the pork chops, or the smothered pork chops planter style, is the typical seasonings of Louisiana: onion, celery, bell pepper, all down into the black iron skillet. Again, these skillets were probably brought here by the Germans in the late 1600s, because this is the typical cookware that we find in all the plantation homes many years later, and we know for a fact that the Germans had to bring the majority of this cookware with them. Okay, we can turn this over just... You can see how thin they are. Obviously, they're going to cook very, very quickly. And you also want to remember that once we put all of the onions and seasonings into the pot, they've got to continue to cook just a little bit more to become nice and tender. Okay, the seasonings. Onions, obviously. A little bit of celery. Of course, some nice garlic. Right down into the dish. And for color, a little bit red bell pepper and golden bell pepper. And then, of course, mushrooms. The planters used a tremendous amount of mushrooms because mushrooms were available to them all in and out of the bayous of South Louisiana. So mushrooms were a staple in just about every planter's breakfast pot, needless to say. Look at all those nice flavors into the dish. And then either water or broth. Of course, there was always a nice kettle of broth going on the stove. Look how beautiful that is and how hot that is. Imagine how warm that old black skillet is here. Once the broth goes down into the pork chops, then the onions and celery and bell pepper and all those things start to cook nicely. And this would slowly cook for about 30 minutes until it got nice and brown. And let me show you what it looks like at that point, because I have some already done. I want to get this skillet out of the way here. And I want you to take a look at these planter breakfast pork chops. Take a look at that into the skillet here. Look at this. Look how nice and brown and tender they've become. And this would be put right onto the table of the planter's breakfast at 10 o'clock in the morning. This whole saute pan, this old black iron skillet, would be put right onto the table for service. Of course, it was always garnished with fresh green onions. I'm going to put a little green onions into it, parsley, little touch of parsley, and then finish with just a touch of the red bell pepper. Isn't that a beautiful dish? And you can imagine just how hearty that dish was when the planters got in from the fields at 10 o'clock in the morning. Something certainly to keep those guys going for another, couple hours or so. Now, that's the first dish of the planter's breakfast. What is the obvious next thing? Well, obviously, eggs were everywhere because chickens as well as pork came with the planters. So eggs would have been everywhere, and of course, egg dishes are just synonymous with great breakfasts in New Orleans, like the egg sardou and eggs hussard and eggs benedict, all those great dishes. But the planters needed something just a little more, I guess a little heartier than those classical egg dishes. So they created a couple for themselves. And the dish that I want to do for you today, I know good and well that you're going to want to duplicate using seafoods in your own area. I'm going to do the crawfish omelet, or the crawfish scrambled eggs, I should say, of the Bayou country, or of the planter's breakfast. We're going to begin, of course, by putting a little butter into our black iron skillet. Again, a little butter or vegetable oil, margarine, whatever you would have used. The planters probably would have used lard or animal fat because that's what they had to cook with. So just about every one of these pots would have been, I guess, coated with a little lard in the bottom. Of course, the crawfish omelets had to be hearty and seasoned Cajun and Creole style already. Even though the Cajuns hadn't arrived, they still had to have that hearty flavor in the pots of the Germans in South Louisiana. So they went in with a little onions, celery, garlic, all traditional flavors of European cooking. And the Germans were no different. They wanted to have a lot of those flavors in the pot. The Germans actually ran the river of Louisiana for, I guess about 100 years until the Cajuns arrived in 1785, and they settled the west bank of the river. The Germans were on the east bank of the river. And since the Germans were mainly men and the Acadians were mainly women, you can imagine that it didn't take long for those Germans to start swimming that river, and a lot of intermarriage started to take place between the Germans and the Acadian women. And I guess I'm a product of one of those swims because I'm half German and half Acadian in my own background, as is a lot of the Cajuns of South Louisiana. So this dish was typical of what we would have been eating back then. Now that I have onions and celery and garlic cooking, I'm going to put, let's say a couple eggs down into the bowl. I have an old crock bowl here, again, a bowl that was obviously brought over some of those German families in the very early years of Louisiana history. I'm going to whip these 3 or 4 eggs up here. And you can see that my onions and celery and bell pepper and garlic are all cooking. Now I'm going to add the crawfish to the dish. Now, of course, remember that you can use shrimp or mussels or clams or just anything, lobster, little pieces of lobster into the dish. But there was so much crawfish in the bayous of Louisiana, obviously that would have been the dish for the crawfish scrambled eggs. Okay, into the eggs now I'm going to put a little milk. There was a lot of milk and cream available, obviously, to the Germans because they were really, really big cattle ranchers. They also ran some of the big dairy farms of South Louisiana, so milk was an early part of their existence. And then a little green onions. Got to have some green onions. Salt, needless to say. And a little Louisiana hot sauce right down into the eggs. Now imagine what's in this egg dish of the planter's breakfast. We already have into the black iron skillet onions, celery, bell pepper, a touch of garlic. Now into the eggs we have cream, hot sauce, and just a little touch of green onions. Now I'm going to pour that right over the crawfish. Oh boy, if you can just smell all of those flavors coming together into that skillet, you wouldn't believe it. No wonder these planters were so excited about coming in at 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay, I'll stir this around and allow this to cook for just a second here while we look at some of the other dishes associated with the planter's breakfast. And some of those other dishes were really unique to the bayous of Louisiana, but many, many cultures have picked up on some of those dishes since. I'll turn the fire down on my eggs while I show you some of these dishes quickly here. The first one, you've got to see this. Wait till you see this. This is Acadian-style bacon. The whole pork loin was actually cooked, wrapped in brown sugar, coated with a little cracked black pepper. You can see the black pepper on it. And then a little thyme and possibly some sassafras, and then put into the smokehouse for about 6 or 7 hours. And then for breakfast, it was just reheated in the oven and sliced, as you can see, and made a wonderful accompaniment to the scrambled eggs, the crawfish scrambled eggs. One of the great meat dishes of the early planters' breakfast. But this is so exciting. When I look at this plate, it reminds me of my early days in Louisiana, sitting around that planter's breakfast table. You've got to take a look at this. This is homemade sausages. This is called pork platines in Louisiana. The pork sausages all made by hand and just fried in the black iron skillet. This here was the hogshead cheese, and it was always cooked with grits and white and red boudin, very typical of French culture, also German culture. The Germans probably bought boudin with them, red and white. It's the pork inside of the casing, very well flavored and normally served hot for breakfast. And then, of course, the Cajun or German sausage, the chorizo, right across the front of the plate. Just 4 or 5 different meats of the typical planter's breakfast. And then, I have to show you this. This is the grits patties. And we would take the grits and make it well in advance, flavor it with endives and other flavorings, and then pour it on a sheet to cool. Cut it with a biscuit cutter and pan fry it in butter. What a wonderful, wonderful dish of the planter's breakfast, all to accompany the eggs and the sausages and all those other things. The eggs are already done, and I'll just leave them in the skillet, of course, because everything was served on the planter's table just like this, right into the black iron skillets, very hot skillets of the Germans, Cajuns, and Creoles of Bayou Country. Well, I told you I had a great friend that was going to come to visit with me later on, and I tell you what, I hear those footsteps.
Hello, John.
Boy, is it
Comment
great.
ça va, huh?
Oh, comme ça. How are you doing? It's great to see you. Great. I know that everybody out there is going to remember you as the SO reporter. I sure do, but I love those stories you used to tell, and we're going to talk about those stories in a minute, but you're a great coffee drinker, and so am I. We drink tons of coffee. I've got a pot of that café noir right here cooking.
Great.
And as all good Cajun homes would have, it's been sitting in a little black skillet, staying nice and hot, and you've got 2 cups there.
And that's the pot that makes the perfect coffee.
Boy, this is the café noir of the planter's breakfast. No planter's breakfast would be complete without that great, great café noir. Let me put this back in the skillet. And it stayed on the stove all day so that the planters could come in and get a little sip. Hey, salute, as we say in Cajun country, right? Get a little sip of that café noir.
You know, there's an old Cajun saying about how they like the coffee. If I can remember all of it, it's chaud comme la fer, hot as hell.
Hot as hell, yeah.
Let's see, yes. And noir comme le diable, black as the devil.
Right.
Douce comme un ange, sweet as an angel. And fort comme le mort, strong as love. So.
Boy, I tell you, and that describes Cajun coffee. And you know, they needed a good hearty coffee to go with all these hearty meals of the bayous. You know, coffee came to Louisiana very, very early. Most people don't realize that coffee originated way out east, where actually sheep farmers found the sheep grazing on this little bitty berry, and they observed that the sheep would stay awake all night running all around the range when they ate the little berry, whereas sheep who didn't eat the berry would just go to sleep at night. So they started to investigate and found out that that berry had just a lot of something in it that would keep you going. So some kind of way or other, the coffee bean made its way into the monasteries, and the monks actually toasted the berry and put it in hot water and would sip it all day long, and it kept them awake at night to write in those big, big books. A very interesting story, but I tell you, no Cajun table in South Louisiana was ever without a pot of coffee.
And nowhere in the world is coffee as good. Well, some places in Europe you can get good coffee, but I don't think anywhere is any better coffee than in Louisiana, and certainly not in the United States. That's, I know some places I've been, the coffee looks as though it had a drop of coffee and the rest was water.
Well, you know, I remember in my own from my early days growing up in a Cajun cabin, I remember the great smell of Cajun coffee just permeating the whole area of the cabin. Of course, it was too strong for us to drink.
Oh, so they would start out with cafe au lait.
Yeah, so they'd put a little hot cream into it and sugar, and we would just sit there drinking our cafe au lait with biscuits every morning. But look, this wasn't the only beverage of the Cajun table or of the planter's breakfast. There was another beverage, too, and we know it today as mimosas. Now, you know what mimosas are. You know, it's an orange drink that's flavored in the old days with cherry bounce. You know what cherry bounce is?
Oh, yeah, made with those little wild cherries, the coon cherries.
The little coon cherries or the little bird cherries.
Yeah.
And the mimosas would be made up and put on the planter's breakfast table early in the morning. That cherry bounce had a little kick to it, and that would kind of give them that little pick-me-up.
Get you bouncing early.
Hey, let me see if we can get ourselves pick-me-up out here with a little bit of the mimosas. Today it's made with champagne and orange juice. Isn't that nice? Huh? It was made with cherry bounce. Sometimes they would put muscadine wine into it, all kind of different flavors. But what a great, great, great drink on the planter's breakfast table. Just
I got to have another sip of this.
Oh, hey, just keep it. You notice all the great foods out here today. I mean, we have the smothered pork chops. We have, what's this? You can see it. You can see that.
Crawfish omelet.
Crawfish omelet, very famous at the planter's breakfast. And look at all these great foods out here. Have you ever, I know you travel a tremendous amount all around the world, have you ever seen that array of food on any other breakfast table?
Only where people work hard. Like on ranches, I worked up in Montana for a while, and a rancher's breakfast up there would be just as hearty, but wouldn't have quite this variety of foods. But there'd be plenty of it. Did have pork chops, but not the same sort of pork chops, and steak, eggs, bacon, all kinds of food, just because they worked hard early in the morning, and they got hungry too.
And it would keep them going all day. And you know, I remember as a young boy certainly being a part of the planter's breakfast. And we would go into the fields real early, and of course I wasn't sitting out doing the kind of labor these guys were, but we would always bring a little biscuit or a little sandwich with some cane syrup, and that would keep us going during the early morning hours. But then at 10 o'clock, we were about to starve to death. And I think one of the great things about the Bayou country, where the planters were carving out these great plantations, is the variety of raw products that were available to them. First of all, we had a subtropical climate, so we had all of the beautiful produce growing everywhere, wild vegetation and all of that, and of course the Germans bringing the pork and beef and lamb and all those things. So it was a great area to create in, I think.
Oh, but some of the native foods of Louisiana can't be matched anywhere in the world. This crawfish, for example, there's you know, I'm quite a fan of folklore of all kinds.
Sure.
And I think there's an old Cajun song about crawfish ain't scared of a 6-mule team, but he see a Cajun coming, and then he scream or something like that.
Well, is that true, huh? There's a lot of stories and songs written about the eating habits of the Cajuns and Creoles, and certainly about the mama crawfish teaching their young crawfish, hey, don't be scared of that, that's a cow, or don't be scared of that, that's a horse, but be real Cajun, scared of that, that's a Cajun. Okay, you know what I want you to do? We got to cook a little bit, too, here. What I want to do is a great, great dish that's also associated with the planter's breakfast. Why don't you put in a little bit of that butter oil? You see that butter right there? Just put a little bit in there. What I'm going to do is a sautéed yam dish. Now, you know, we have yams in Louisiana. But just a little bit more. We like a lot. There you go. That's fine right there. What I'm going to do is look at these beautiful yams. Now, these yams have already been poached, and you can see they're nice and tender. And all we're going to do is quickly saute them for just a second into the black iron skillet with a little oil. And
Let me ask you a question about that, John. Something I've wondered about is the difference between sweet potatoes and yams. Now, I know in Louisiana especially, the terms are used kind of interchangeably, but I do also know that there is something completely different that is the original yam. What is the difference?
Well, you know, that's probably one of the main confusions in Louisiana today is the difference between sweet potatoes and yams. It's important for people to remember that yams are just a variety of sweet potato. Not all sweet potatoes are yams, but all yams are sweet potatoes. Yams, of course, the color is different. The yams have a nice reddish color, whereas the sweet potato has a yellow color to it. The yams are a lot fuller of sugar, whereas the sweet potatoes tend to be a little less sweet. The sweet potatoes are stringier and drier, whereas the yams are a lot meatier and without any string. So it's just a variety of sweet potatoes. But boy, I'm going to tell you what, there's nothing in the world better than a Louisiana yam. It was developed right here. So what I'll do is put a few of those into the butter like that. And why don't you just kind of move them around for me there a little bit. These are just going to be absolutely great.
Incidentally, did you know the origin of the word yam?
No,
that I do know.
No, I didn't know that.
It comes from Africa. Nyami, I believe the Fulani tribe in Central and West Africa named them Nyami, which means eat.
To eat.
And I think I've never heard this or read it, but I suspect that maybe yummy comes from the same thing, you know.
From the sweet potatoes. Well, what we're doing here is just sauteing them, as I say, in a little butter. You can use butter, oil, anything you would like. And then we're going to put a little brown sugar on top of them. And, of course, the cane syrup of Louisiana is just great in here.
Do I turn them?
No, just leave them just like that for a second until they get
pecans,
nice
too.
and brown on one side. And then, of course, we can flavor them with cinnamon or nutmeg or anything else into the dish. So it's a very simple dish to do, and I guarantee you it looks like you've cooked that before.
Oh, no.
Well,
it's simple for someone like you, John, but not...
Well, Brooks, I want to thank you so much for coming into the kitchen and joining us today and cooking some of these yams and giving us some of the stores of origin.
Provided I get to taste them.
You'll get to taste it. And I want to thank you for joining us as we recreated this Louisiana Planter's Breakfast. And come back next time as we continue to cook up more of these great Taste of Louisiana. We're going to eat sweet potatoes. Flip those things over. Get me a little spoon here. And I'll put a little cinnamon and nutmeg on. There you go. Oh, great. And we put just a little bit more butter.
Funding for this program was provided by Bruce Foods Corporation, makers of Bruce's Yams and other distinctive Louisiana-style food products. And by the Dairy Farmers of Louisiana. Fresh ideas in cooking begin with milk.